Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
Africa, the cradle of humankind, is a land of extraordinary beauty, profound civilizations, vast natural resources, and indomitable resilience. Yet, when one gazes across the social, economic, and political landscape of the continent today, a painful and paradoxical image emerges. Africa, blessed with everything necessary for wealth and stability, struggles under the weight of poverty, debt, conflict, and underdevelopment. This contradiction is not accidental, nor is it the product of African failure. Rather, it is the enduring legacy of a dark and complex history, one shaped by the systematic exploitation and dehumanization of the African continent by European powers. The narrative of how Europe underdeveloped Africa is not merely one of historical interest. It is a necessary confrontation with truth that has long been buried under centuries of imperial propaganda, academic distortion, and the silence of global powers. Walter Rodney, the Guyanese scholar, ignited global consciousness when he published his seminal work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, in 1972. But even decades later, the revelations he exposed are still either dismissed or downplayed. This article aims to journey into the heart of that truth, to understand the mechanisms of Europe's centuries-long plunder of Africa, and to show how underdevelopment was not a natural consequence of African choices, but a deliberate outcome engineered through slavery, colonialism, economic manipulation, and cultural subjugation. The truth is not merely hidden, it is feared, for once exposed, it dismantles the myths that have sustained Western superiority for generations. Before Europe cast its long, greedy shadow over Africa, the continent was home to flourishing civilizations, complex governance systems, thriving economies, and far-reaching trade networks. Kingdoms like Mali, Songhai, Benin, Congo, Zimbabwe, and Ethiopia were marvels of their time. In the 14th century, Mali's Emperor Mansa Musa became the richest man in recorded history, his wealth based on gold and trade that rivaled that of Europe. Timbuktu was not a myth but a real and vibrant center of learning, home to libraries, universities, and scholars who studied astronomy, medicine, theology, and mathematics. African societies had established systems of agriculture, metallurgy, architecture, and commerce that were sophisticated in their own right. Africa was not a dark continent. That phrase, a European invention, was used to justify invasion and domination. In truth, Africa was self-sustaining and evolving. The land was fertile, its rivers and coasts bustling with trade, its people engaged in dynamic cultural exchange. What Africa lacked was not progress, but guns, and Europe had them in plenty. The transatlantic slave trade, which began in the 15th century and lasted for over 400 years, was the single most brutal and devastating event in African history. Over 12 million Africans were forcibly removed from their homelands, shackled in chains, and subjected to unimaginable horrors in the Americas and the Caribbean. This systematic theft of human capital not only depopulated the continent, it also ripped apart families, societies, and traditional structures. Entire communities were destabilized as wars were waged to capture slaves for European traders. African rulers were manipulated or coerced into participating in the trade, often under threat of violence. Europe built its modern wealth on the backs of African slaves. Cities like Liverpool, Nantes, Lisbon, and Amsterdam flourished from the profits of slavery. The sugar, cotton, and tobacco industries that enriched Britain, France, and Portugal relied entirely on enslaved labor. While Europe's industrial revolution accelerated, Africa's development was violently halted. The slave trade did not merely exploit Africa. It created underdevelopment by draining the continent of its most valuable resource, its people. When slavery ended in the 19th century, Europe did not release its grip on Africa. Instead, it tightened it. In 1884–85, the Berlin Conference, a gathering of European powers with not a single African present, divided the continent like a pie. Colonialism was not about civilizing Africa. It was about extracting its wealth. European powers established artificial borders, grouped together hostile ethnicities, and tore apart established systems of governance. Colonial regimes imposed brutal systems of forced labor, taxation, and land alienation. The Congo Free State under King Leopold II of Belgium became infamous for its atrocities, with millions killed or maimed in rubber extraction. In British colonies, natives were taxed for the land they had always lived on, coerced into growing cash crops instead of food, and subjected to dehumanizing racial policies. The French practiced assimilation, demanding that Africans abandon their identities in exchange for French civilization. The Portuguese, under Salazar, turned Angola and Mozambique into labor camps. The colonial state was designed to extract. Railways and roads were built not to connect communities, but to transport raw materials, gold, diamonds, oil, rubber, cocoa, from the interior to coastal ports for European export. Education was limited, focused on producing clerks and laborers rather than scientists or leaders. Healthcare, housing, and infrastructure were directed towards settler communities. Africa's wealth funded Europe's development, while Africa was left impoverished. When African nations began to gain independence in the mid-20th century, they did not inherit sovereign states. They inherited the wreckage of colonialism. Economies were still structured for export, dependent on a few raw commodities. There was little to no industrial base, limited infrastructure, and virtually no control over international trade terms. Worse still, the departing colonizers ensured that African countries remained dependent through unfair trade agreements, exploitative loans, and neocolonial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. These institutions, under the guise of aid and development, enforced structural adjustment programs, SAPs, in the 1980s and 1990s that devastated African economies. Governments were forced to cut public spending, privatize state assets, and open their markets to foreign corporations. Education and healthcare systems collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed, and poverty deepened. The real beneficiaries of these reforms were multinational companies and foreign investors. Africa became the testing ground for neoliberalism, its people reduced to statistics in an economic experiment. Meanwhile, Africa's resources continued to flow outward. Oil from Nigeria, uranium from Niger, coltan from Congo, cocoa from Ghana, all extracted for foreign profit, often leaving behind environmental destruction and political instability. European companies and governments profited from corrupt regimes, funded proxy wars, and exploited conflict zones for cheap labor and materials. Beyond economics, Europe's underdevelopment of Africa included a cultural assault. African history was rewritten, its languages suppressed, and its religions demonized. Generations were taught to look down on their own heritage, to associate whiteness with progress and blackness with backwardness. Colonial education systems promoted European history, values, and heroes, erasing Africa's contributions to human civilization. The psychological impact was profound. Self-doubt, internalized inferiority, and cultural dislocation became widespread. To this day, many African nations still operate with colonial-era legal systems, official languages, and administrative structures. Eurocentric standards continue to define what is modern, while indigenous knowledge systems are marginalized. The cultural hegemony established by colonial powers was so thorough that many Africans today still view development as something that must come from the West, rather than from within. Europe did not develop Africa. Europe underdeveloped Africa. This is not a rhetorical statement. It is a historical fact backed by centuries of evidence. From the slave ships that carved bloody paths across the Atlantic to the colonial empires that bled the continent dry, to the economic policies that maintain dependency today, the story of Africa's underdevelopment is one of deliberate action. But Africa is not a victim without agency. Across the continent, a new generation is rising, scholars, artists, activists, and leaders who are reclaiming history, rebuilding economies, and reimagining futures. Understanding how Europe underdeveloped Africa is not about assigning guilt. It is about demanding justice, accountability, and transformation. It is about breaking the silence, telling the truth, and refusing to allow the legacy of colonialism to define the future. The time has come for Africa to rise on its own terms, to restore its stolen legacy, and to chart a path towards self-determined prosperity. But this journey begins with truth they hide, but which must now be told.